right, grab your Bibles. James chapter 5 is, of course, where we're going to be, getting close to finishing out this series. This is week 12, so we just have a couple of weeks after today left. And so last week, what we looked at is how our identity, if our identity and self-worth is wrapped up in our money and in our stuff, then we're going to be in a constant state of misery, right? This is what James tells us. Why? Because it's temporary, right? Money and stuff is temporary. It could be gone in a moment. And so if our identity and self-worth is wrapped up in that stuff, we're going to be in a constant state of misery for two reasons. Number one, it never satisfies, right? Because they just keep rolling out new phones. They keep building new houses. They keep making new cars. Right? They keep constantly upgrading stuff, and if we're always looking for the newest and latest and greatest, and we'll never be satisfied, and so we're just in this constant state of misery, trying to bolster our identity and self-worth and stuff that's just temporary, right? And then the second reason is that this stuff never lasts. It could be gone in a moment, right? God forbid a natural disaster comes through and it's reduced to rubble and ash. And we've seen examples of this just in the last couple of months around the world, right? That it can be gone in a moment. And if our identity and self-worth is in this stuff, it's foolish madness and it makes us miserable. And so James tells us, how do we overcome this? How do we overcome our identity and self-worth being wrapped up in this stuff? And I think the answer is just simple generosity, right? Just being intentional about giving money away, right? Making space in our budget, making cutbacks and sacrifices, and being intentional about giving money away, whether it be to the local church, whether it be to missions and outreach opportunities, or whether it just be generous towards one another. Looking for opportunities, not just to take care of needs among us, but even going above and beyond and just being generous. Blessing others for just no reason other than just to bless them. Right? Looking for opportunities to be generous on all occasions. And so that's what we looked at last week. Now, today, as I've said many times throughout this series, so this is week 12, right? So on repeat for 12 weeks, I've been saying that James, his whole point in this letter is he's teaching us how to have genuine living faith, right? How our faith can be genuine and we're not be hypocrites, right? Because we even took a poll on week 1 of this series and we found out that we're all hypocrites, right? We all say one thing and do something differently. We all believe one thing but live a different way, right? There's always disconnects between our head, heart, and hands. But of course, we don't want to be hypocrites. Right? And so how do we have genuine faith and remove the hypocrisy from our lives? How do we have living faith and remove the dead, cold religion from our lives? This is what James is ultimately trying to teach us. And what he's going to tell us today is that if we want to have genuine living faith, we need to be patient because it's going to take time. To develop genuine, rich, deep faith, it's a slow and sometimes painful process, and we need to have patience through it. So that's what we're going to look at today here. James chapter 5, verse 7 through 12 is our text. So starting in verse 7, this is what he says. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, humanity has worked tirelessly since the dawn of creation until now. We have worked tirelessly on eliminating the need to be patient. Right? We don't like patience. We don't want to be patient, and we have worked hard, and we've become quite good at it on eliminating. So we haven't worked on trying to become more patient. We've worked on trying to eliminate the need to be patient altogether. right? So in the 1950s, two brothers by the name of Mac and Dick McDonald opened a restaurant named, you guessed it, McDonald's. Right? And so it was an individual burger joint that they opened in the 1950s, and these two brothers said, what can we do to set our restaurant apart from all the other restaurants? Right? All the other burger joints out there, what can we do that can set it apart from all the others? And their answer was speed. And I don't mean the drug, right, but speed and efficiency, right? And so they came up with this system that they called the speedy service system. They came up with this idea of we can have an assembly line type concept where we can have it to where you show up to the window, you place your order, and within seconds, your food is handed to you. This was a marvel of ingenuity at the time. In fact, there's a movie, it's on Netflix, called The Founder. It's an interesting movie. I encourage you to watch it, especially if you like biopics and kind of movies based on historical history. But you can see in that movie how these brothers come up with this idea, and this man, Ray Kroc, he partners with them, and he's the one that franchises it and makes McDonald's into what it is today. Right? But what made McDonald's so successful, and not just McDonald's, but all the other fast food joints that have followed after them, what made them so successful is that they tapped into this human desire that we want to eradicate the need to be patient. Right? We want it now. Right? When I order my food, I want it by the time I hand them the money, I want my food given to me. Right? And they tapped into human impatience, and it was a wild success. Right? And I could give many examples. Let me just give a couple here. So that iPhone that I've been mentioning the past couple of weeks. Right? So 2 weeks ago, I talked about how the iPhone, right? We have all the information we want at our fingertips. Right? So 20 years ago, if you wanted to know an answer to something, you had to work for it. Right? You had to go to the library. You had to hunt an answer down. Now we have it at our fingertips. We don't even have to use our thumbs. Right? We can just speak into the phone and it tells us an answer, right? Because we want it now, and we have all the information we could ever want at our fingertips. This is just our desire. We want to eliminate the need to be patient. We don't want to wait for anything. One of my favorite marvels of ingenuity is Amazon. I absolutely love Amazon. I do 90% of my shopping on Amazon. I don't even have to leave the house most of the time. It's great. You can order anything on Amazon. And then they came up with this idea of Amazon Prime, right, where you can order something and within 2 days, sometimes same day, they'll deliver it to you. But then that wasn't enough, so they came up with Prime Now. So now if you're willing to pay the extra money, you can have something delivered to your door within an hour of placing the order. Right? It's incredible. But again, it's this idea that we don't want to wait. What can we do to speed this thing up? Right? So we can place it. We don't even have to get it out. We don't even have to change. Right? We could be in our underwear, place an order, and within an hour, they deliver it to your door. It's unbelievable. I love it. But this is our desire. We want to eliminate the need to be patient. Again, humanity, we haven't strived on how can we become patient people. We've strived on how can we eliminate the need to be patient altogether. And then I'll give you one more because I think we can all relate to this. How many of you get frustrated with slow internet? Right? I mean, it's just, right, and I've confessed this to you before that it's the bane of my existence, right? My downfall is slow internet. Right? I wander from the faith briefly when my internet isn't loading quickly, right? And so this is just the reality. But our internet today, again, 20, 30 years ago, you had dial-up, right? You had to make sure somebody didn't need to use the phone, and it took 30 years to connect. And right, I mean, but now our internet is ridiculously fast, and yet it's not fast enough for us. And we get frustrated and we'll cancel a download because it's taking too long. We'll yell at Netflix because it won't load quick enough. Right? I mean, this is just the reality is we are unbelievably impatient people, and it's getting worse because again, we've gotten really good at eliminating the need to be patient. Right? Whatever we can do to eradicate it completely from our lives, we want it now. Right? We expect everything to be instantaneous, including our own spiritual development. When it comes to our spiritual development and spiritual growth, we expect it to be quick and instantaneous. Right? We want quick, fast, easy results. And this is why many people get frustrated with their faith. Many people get frustrated with their faith and their walk with God because it's not going as fast as they want. So let me take another poll here this morning. How many of you, by show of hands, and I want you to answer honestly, don't feel obligated to raise your hand, but if you would answer honestly, how many of you would say that you are not where you want to be spiritually? Right? You're just not where. Now keep your hands up and just kind of look around the room. Like it looks to be almost 100% of us in this room would say, I am not where I want to be. I'm not where I know I should be. Now, in this room, we have people that maybe you've been saved for a very short period of time. Right? So maybe just less than a year. And you might have even grown up in church, but you would say that just, maybe very recently you got serious about your faith. It became personal. So maybe you've been saved for a very short period of time. Some of you in this room, and I won't mention any names, but some of you in this room have been saved for maybe 20 years or 30 years. Maybe you've been following Jesus for 40, 50 plus years. Right? And yet, we took a poll. 100% of us said, I'm not where I want to be. I'm not where I should be. So what this tells us is it doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian. It doesn't matter how long you've been following Jesus. There's always room to grow. Right? There's always room to grow. And this is just the reality. And yet, when it comes to our spiritual growth and development, we want it fast, we want it quick, and we want it now. But the reality is that our spiritual growth, it's a lifelong journey of following Jesus. Right? It's day after day, one foot in front of another, moving forward. And sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it's even painful. But we keep pressing on, and it's not quick, and it's not easy, right? And this is what James is trying to tell us here. So again, in verse 7 and 8, this is what he says. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So James tells us that we are to remain patient until the coming of the Lord. And the coming of the Lord is the day that Jesus will return, establish his kingdom, make all things new, and eradicate sin and death once and for all. In other words, the coming of the Lord is the day that we will finally be made perfect. And until then, you ain't perfect. Right? I mean, we just did a poll. We all confess, I'm not perfect, right? I have room to grow. I'm not where I want to be. I'm not where I should be, right? And so until the coming of the Lord, we are to remain patient. Until that day, we are to remain patient and steadfast. And James says, just like the farmer waiting for the harvest. Now, truth be told, I know very little about farming and gardening. I've only ever visited farms. I didn't grow up on one. I've never worked on one. I don't garden. My mom has a garden in her backyard. Some of you might have a little garden. But I know, all I know about farming and gardening is what I've read about and observed. But there's two things that I think are pertinent about farming in relation to our spiritual growth. The first one is that it's all about seasons. Right? There's certain things that grow in certain times of the year, right? And so you have to plant at a certain time in order for the harvest to come in at a certain time, right? It's all about seasons. And then there's seasons like winter that nothing grows, right? It all dies off and you have to bring it back to life in the spring. It's all about seasons. And the same is absolutely true when it comes to our spiritual life. That it's all about seasons. There are ups and downs, valleys and mountaintops, winters and seasons. And so we like to think, what we want is our spiritual development to be this constant uphill trajectory. Right? So we get saved, and then from there, it's just this constant progression, uphill trajectory of growth and happiness and perfection. In reality, it's more like this. Right? It's just this constant up and down, mountains and valleys, winters and springs. And this is just the reality of following Jesus. There's seasons that we go through. And what I want to say is don't despise the seasons, especially winter. Right? And so if you feel like you're in a winter season of your spiritual life where it just feels like things are dead and cold, it feels like God's not listening to you and God's not speaking. We don't like those seasons, and we always want to be in the spring. But God's got a reason and a purpose for the winter. God's doing something in the midst of that, and often what he's doing is he's killing some things off so that he can bring new life. So don't despise the seasons. We love the springtime. We love the summer. We love the mountaintops. But God has a reason for the winter. God has a reason for the valleys. And don't despise them, because God's bringing incredible growth through it. So it's all about seasons. And then the second thing when it comes to farming and gardening, it takes a lot of time and patience, which is partly why I don't do it. Right? It takes a lot of time and patience, right? You don't see immediate results. So if you throw some seeds in the ground and you water it for a couple of days, and after 2 days you get frustrated, say, I planted the seeds and I've been watering it, it's been 2 days. What gives, right? And then you give up, you are going to miss out on the harvest, right? Because it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of work. But eventually it pays off, right? Eventually you see the fruit. And the same is true in our spiritual life, that it takes time. And what often happens is, again, we want immediate, quick results. And so we often get frustrated because we're not growing as quickly as we hope. We're not seeing fruit come as quickly as we hope. And we often get frustrated. And I've seen far too many people walk away short of the harvest. They turn away and they get frustrated with God, and they walk away just short of finally seeing some fruit. It takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. This is what James is telling us, that if we remain patient and steadfast, we will eventually see a harvest at the coming of the Lord. Now, another way to think of spiritual growth, and I think it's more helpful for me, I relate to it better, maybe it will be for you as well, but it's exercise, right? And in fact, we already talked about this week 1 of this series, right? That the exercising of our faith builds endurance, right? And so exercise is a great way to understand spiritual growth and development, because they work very similar, right? And the truth is that working out is not fun. It's not fun, it's miserable and painful, right? It takes a lot of time, right? You have to dedicate time every single day to do it. It takes money, and it takes a whole lot of discipline, right? And it's not easy, and it's not fun, and it's not quick, and there's no easy solutions and quick gadgets, right? Even though they keep trying to sell them to us. So you have remember the Flex belt or whatever it was called? You got those infomercials where this belt you can strap around your abdomen. And in the commercials, the guy's like flipping the channels. And it's working out his abs. And what they say is, you don't even have to do anything. You don't have to do any sit-ups. Right? You could just surf the channels, and you can get ripped abs. Right? But they're always selling us this stuff. Most recently, the shake weight, I don't even get that. I guess it's just you shake the thing, and you don't even actually lift any weights. You could get ripped arms by just shaking this weight or something. I don't understand. But they're constantly rolling out these gadgets that trying to tell you, like, you can get results without actually doing anything. Right? And this stuff sells because it plays right into this desire of us. We want it. Like, I can get quick, easy results, and I don't actually have to work for it. Yes, please. Right? But when it comes to working out, if you actually want to see results, if you want to lose weight, if you want to get in shape, if you actually want to see results, it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time and dedication. There are no quick, easy results. It's not a 90-day program. Right? So you can pop P90X in, and on day 90, you can be like, whew, mission accomplished. But then what about day 91? Right? If you want to see results and if you want to maintain results, you got to keep going. It's not a 90-day program. It's a lifestyle change. Right? And a lot of people, they might start, and this is why in January the gyms are filled. Right? The gyms are packed in January because people make their New Year's resolutions. I'm going to get in shape this year, and then they realize this is hard. Like, I'm going to have to do this every single day for the rest of my life if I actually want to stay in shape? No, thank you. Right? We don't like it, right? But this is the reality, is that working out, if we want to exercise, if we want to get in shape, it's a lifestyle change day after day, putting in the work to see the transformation. And the same is absolutely true about our spiritual development. There's no quick and easy answers. There's no 90-day discipleship program that's going to whip you into shape. It's a lifestyle of every day, one day after another, one foot in front of the other, following Jesus. Every single day making the decision that today I'm going to follow Jesus. Today I'm going to be obedient. Every single day for the rest of your life. There are no quick, easy answers. It's day-to-day faithfulness. My favorite definition, I've quoted this before, and I'll quote it many times until the day I die, because I absolutely love it. It's by a man named Eugene Peterson, one of my favorite writers. Read his stuff, highly recommended. But he defines faithfulness as this: faithfulness is long obedience in the same direction. I absolutely love that. It's my favorite definition of faithfulness. It's long obedience in the same direction. And it doesn't mean that we don't stumble and fall from time to time, right? But when we stumble and fall, we get back up and we keep going. Right? It doesn't mean that there's not going to be highs and lows. Right? There's going to be mountains, and then there's going to be valleys, and then we climb back up the mountain, and then we go back into the valley. But we keep going, right? It's long obedience in the same direction. Despite the mountains and valleys, despite the winters and springs, through it all, we keep pressing on. Day after day, one foot in front of the other, long obedience in the same direction. This is faithfulness. This is faithfulness. We keep going, and we don't give up, and we don't give in. We press on, and we obey and honor God day after day, even in the ordinary and mundane. Right? So we like glitz and glamour. Right? We do. We're always looking for the next high. Right? We're always looking forward to the next vacation, the next trip, right? The next weekends, the next holiday. Right? We're always looking forward to the next big, great thing that's going to entertain us and make us excited. But the reality is that the majority of life is the ordinary and mundane, everyday routine. I mean, think about that. Like, the majority of your life is just routine. Stuff, like most of your life you don't even remember, because it's just one day after another. Waking up, going to work, feeding your kids, putting them to bed, taking them to school. Like, this is the majority of your life. Right? And so a good way to think of this is marriage. Right? And I'm going to use my parents as an example, because they're about to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary, which is an accomplishment. Yes. So 40 years, I guarantee you they've had their highs, right? They've had their high moments, right? Their wedding day, I'm sure, was one of those high moments, right? I wasn't there, but I'm sure it was. And I don't guarantee, I know that they've had their low moments. I've been there for some of those. We won't talk about it, right? But they've had their highs and they've had their lows. But the majority of those 40 years have been ordinary, mundane days of just going about the routine, raising their kids, going to work. And so they've had their highs, vacations, and anniversaries, and they've had their lows. But the majority of their marriage in 40 years has just been 40 years of faithfulness. Day after day, one foot in front of the other, faithfully serving and loving one another. Even if they don't feel like it, even if they don't want to, making the decision. And this is what it means to follow Jesus. One foot in front of the other, day after day, faithfully following. Despite the pain and despite the suffering and despite the winters and the lows, despite all that, we keep following, we keep serving, we keep obeying. Don't despise the ordinary days. Again, we're always looking for the next high, right? We can't wait till the next vacation. We can't wait till that outing. We're always looking for the highs to keep us entertained. But most of life is ordinary, mundane routine of life. Don't despise the ordinary. My favorite writer, this is just Ryan Clymer quoting his favorite author, Sunday, I guess, but my absolute favorite writer is Frederick Buechner. He says this, that boredom happens when we turn down what life is offering us. That boredom happens when we're turning. So when we get bored, what he's saying is that when we get bored, it's because life is trying to offer us something in the moment and we're not interested, because usually it's mundane and it's ordinary, and we turn it down and we get bored because, again, we're constantly looking for the next high to keep us entertained. Right? And we get bored with life because we're turning down what life is trying to offer us in the moment. Don't turn down what life is offering. Don't turn down what God is offering, even in the routine, mundane, everyday of life. God's always working. God's always speaking. God's always doing something. Pay attention. Listen. Now, so we keep pressing on day after day, one foot in front of the other, despite the pain and suffering, despite mundane and boredom, despite mountains and valleys, right? We keep moving forward in faithful obedience, in patience and steadfastness until the coming of the Lord. Now, what James does in this text is he gives us a couple of examples of patient faithfulness, especially in the midst of suffering. And so the first one is in verse 10. He says, "As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." So the prophets in the Old Testament, the prophets spoke in the name of the Lord, usually reluctantly. Like if you read their stories, usually they did not want to do it, right? God comes to them, says, "I want you to be my prophet. I want you to speak on my behalf." And usually they did it reluctantly. They weren't interested. And they often suffered greatly as a result of their prophecies, right? It was not an easy, fun, glamorous job. They didn't get rich with it. They didn't get famous with it, right? It wasn't a fun, easy job, and yet they did it faithfully, speaking on behalf of the Lord in patient steadfastness. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, I was going to read it, but my notes were already getting too long, so I cut it out. But I encourage you to go back and read. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about the prophets, and it lists out some of the things that they went through. Some things like they were beaten and stoned. Some of them were sawed in half. They were tortured, right? These are what these men and women experienced because of their faithfulness to the Lord. And yet, despite the suffering, despite all of that, they continued on, pressed forward in faithful steadfastness. In fact, in Hebrews 11, it says that they did not see the promise. Right? They did not see their own prophecies fulfilled, and yet they remained faithful and steadfast through it all. So though they did not see the promise, though they did not see the coming of the Lord themselves, they remained faithful and steadfast even through immense suffering. And then James gives us one more example in verse 11. He says, "Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job and have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." I love the story of Job. It's one of my favorite books in the Bible. In fact, I'm hoping to eventually do a study through the book of Job. Maybe this next year, I don't know. We'll see. But eventually we'll look at the life of Job in detail because it's a fascinating story. But in Job, you see that Job loses everything. Right? Job was an incredibly wealthy man. He was blessed. He had a big family. He had lots of land, right? But he loses everything. And literally all that he's left with is a sick body and a cranky wife, right? Not a good situation to be in. And yet, we see in the life of Job that he remains patient and steadfast through it all. Right? He's in misery. I mean, in fact, he even curses the day he was born, right? He doesn't enjoy it. He's in grief and misery, and yet he remains patient and steadfast. And his cranky wife tells him, "Why don't you just curse God and die? Just end the misery now." Right? His friends give him terrible advice, but through it all, he remains patient and steadfast, faithfully serving God, even in the midst of incredible suffering. And this is what God is calling us to. This is what God, He wants us to walk in this sort of faithfulness, this patience and steadfastness, one foot in front of the other, day after day, just like the prophets, just like Job. And I could list off many examples, not just in the Bible, but even in this very room. Right? Some of you have walked through some, and maybe you're still walking through some incredible circumstances, suffering and pain, and yet through it all, just one foot in front of the other, day after day, making the decision, I'm going to keep going. Despite the suffering and pain, day after day, even through the mundane, boring routine of life, just day after day, following Jesus through faithful, patient, steadfast. And we wait for the promises of God to be fulfilled. We wait for the coming of the Lord. But until that day, we continue with patient steadfastness. Now, James warns us of two things that are going to stand in our way of remaining patient and steadfast. And so I want to look at these just real quickly as we get ready to wrap up here. But two things that will stand in our way. The first one is back in verse 9. You may have noticed I skipped verse 9. I did that on purpose. So back in verse 9, James says, "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Now, this word grumble is an interesting word because in the original Greek, it literally means to sigh or to groan. So I think what James is saying here is don't grow impatient with one another. Right? So as we seek to be patient and steadfast, right, faithfully serving the Lord, James tells us don't grow impatient with one another. Why? Because you ain't perfect and no one else is either. Right? Again, we took a poll. 100% of us said, I'm not where I should be. Right? I'm not where I want to be. I'm not perfect. I have room to grow. Right? So none of us are perfect. All of us have room to grow. And yet, we often grow impatient with one another. Why? Because we're imperfect people. Right? Imperfect people get on each other's nerves. Right? Imperfect people rub people the wrong way, right? We're imperfect people, and it's easy for us to grow impatient with one another. And yet we must remember, as we remain patient and steadfast, that we remain patient and steadfast with one another. Right? Not growing impatient with one another's weaknesses, not growing impatient with one another's failures, because we're all on a journey together. Right? We're all imperfect people on a journey of following Jesus together. And none of us are going to be perfect until the coming of the Lord. Right? So don't grow impatient with one another. And then lastly, James says, back down in verse 12, but above all, brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, this is almost a direct quote from Jesus in Matthew 5:33 through 37. We won't read it, but if you want to go back and look, it's literally pretty much a direct quote of Jesus. And to swear an oath is to make a promise. Right? And so what James and what Jesus are saying is to not make a promise that you can't keep, but let your word be your bond. Don't make promises that you can't keep, but just let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. When you say yes, mean it. When you say no, mean it. Right? Don't try to add on by swearing oaths and making promises. Just let your word be your bond. Now, what does this have anything to do with in the context of being patient and steadfast, faithfully serving God? What does this have to do with it? Well, we tend to try to bargain with God by making promises, especially in the midst of suffering. We try to bargain with God by making promises, right? God, I won't do this. God, I will do that. Right? God, I promise that I'm going to start going to church more regularly. God, I promise that I'm going to read the Bible more and I'm going to pray more. I promise that I'll give more to the church. Right? I promise, God, we try to bargain with God, especially in the midst of suffering. God, I promise if I'll be more faithful to you, I'll be more obedient if you'll just eliminate the suffering. Right? If you'll just make the promise come sooner. Right? And we tend to make promises trying to bargain with God. Instead, we ought to serve God with simple yes and no obedience. That's what God's looking for. Not for us to make promises that we can't keep, but He's just looking for simple, faithful obedience. Right? We don't need to swear any oaths because despite our unfaithfulness, God is always faithful. Right? Even when we are completely unfaithful, God is always faithful. So we don't need to swear any oaths and make any promises that we can't keep. Because what happens when we break those promises? We get discouraged, we get frustrated, we think that God's angry with us. But God never wanted us to make the promises in the first place. Right? Even when we are unfaithful, God is always faithful towards us. So we don't make promises. Instead, we rest in Christ's promise. We rest in His faithfulness. And when we stumble and fall, Christ picks us back up. And we continue on day after day, one foot in front of the other, long obedience in the same direction, with patient steadfastness, following Jesus. This is what God has called us to. And my prayer for us is that we would become a more patient, steadfast people. Right? We long for the promises of God to be fulfilled. We long for the coming of the Lord. But in the meantime, through suffering, through boring, mundane, ordinary days of life, through mountains and valleys, springs and winters, we continue on one day after the other, stumbling and falling along the way, but we get back up and we press on until we get to the prize. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you that you are faithful even when we are unfaithful. I thank you that you keep your promises, and we can rest in that this morning. So I pray that you would strengthen us, that you would embolden us, that you would give us more patience and steadfastness in the days ahead. Through suffering, through ordinary days of life, through it all, God, that we would just press on. We would continue on. We wouldn't get discouraged. We wouldn't get frustrated. We wouldn't give up. One foot in front of the other, day after day. Just follow you. I thank you that you're doing a transformation in our hearts and our lives. We may not see it. We may not notice it right away, but you are transforming us day after day, glory after glory. It's in your name we pray. Amen.